Well, hello, everyone. Welcome today to IPDay's webinar titled Moving Towards Collaboration, a Practical Approach. And today, my name is Ariel Pachokas. I'm the Director of Adult and Community Education with Collier County Public Schools. And with me is...
I'm Yolanda Flores, Administrative Director for Post-Secondary Adult and Community Education with Collier County Public Schools.
So before we begin, we have a few things to remember, a little housekeeping. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A option that's open. All attendees' microphones will be muted and you will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on the IPDay website within 48 hours. So as we start, our goals for today are to really explore the needed or the needs to create an effective collaborative partnerships. We're looking at exploring some of the mechanisms and systems needed to ensure everyone's participation. We're also going to be talking about and exploring some of the tools or strategies to facilitate these conversations and collaborations.
So for those of you that have been engaged in the regionalization or the collaboration prior to the Christmas break, now hopefully everyone had a great winter break and now you're back ready to get into the swing of things. And so you have to continue the conversation. Otherwise, if you let too much time lapse, you will forget about those conversations that you started having, about that plan that you started putting together, and then ideas that have come out of it to help you move forward. We are in Region 9, and in Region 9, it consists of Lee, Collier, Hendry, and Glades. And I can tell you, even though we knew we had strong partnerships with other entities, there are some positive things that have come out of these conversations that started last year. The most recent one that I have to share with you is a success, and that is that Future Makers, which is part of one of our community foundations of Southwest Florida, they have hired navigators who are committed to work with some of our adult education population, which again, now it's about maximizing resources in order to best serve our students. But that conversation, I don't think we could have had if it hadn't been for these collaborative partnerships now that we started building, and that now we're moving into a more formalized or operational partnership.
So as Yolanda just mentioned, we've all been in the work and we've all drafted a form of a vision which highlighted our successes, our challenges, and our needs. We've established some goals and we've even created a plan, and that's part of that whole collaborative plan that we submitted. So now we need to continue to move this forward. And like Yolanda mentioned, we want to ensure we have a big piece of this, of the success of something like this, is ensuring we have the right players at the table with the willingness and the availability to not only participate, but make decisions that'll move the whole system forward. And then finally, we're going to need to be focusing on building the components to maximize everyone's time and effort.
And part of that then includes building, having some investment, right? You have to build that structure, that foundation of how you're going to operationalize those partnerships, right? So some of the discussions early on in building that foundation is possibly you have to look at your governance or bylaws. And if that's too strong of a language for your region, it might be just, who is that regional steering committee, right? Who's going to be the decision makers? Is it going to be one person per region? Is it one person per district? Is it one person per district and then each nonprofit that's at the table, right? And then also, how are we going to collaborate? Are we going to use a platform such as Microsoft or Office 365 or Google Drive? How are we going to establish our priorities, our timelines, our meetings, agendas, and minutes. So really now, as you're shifting, you need to start building that foundation. And so as you continue to meet with your region, the first few meetings might be just that, building that foundation.
So here's a representation of the whole process. And we've already been through the exploration phase. And as Yolanda is talking about now, coming up with a game plan to really start, what does this look like and how do we organize ourselves to meet? For those of you that were involved in the collaborative planning and plan and development, you've done the exploration. You've looked at the data. You've had those conversations. You've made the priorities and the plans already. So now the focus is really on what will collaboration really look like, and understand that this building the infrastructure, this first piece of it, is probably going to take the most of the time.
Right, and it takes 2 to 4 years to get from that exploration installation time to that full implementation. Remember, you've already spent some time last year in that exploration, and now it's that foundation building.
So
we can skip this slide because I think we've already talked about this.
So this is where most of us are. We're in the installation phase, and it's in a perfect world, that would be where your game, what your game plan is going to look like, and how we're going to, what we're going to need to really build in place the activities, the conversations, to ensure that all the players that are coming have an equal voice, but also that everyone feels valued and the objectives are going to be met.
So what you need to do is reflect, right? As you move from that informal collaboration to the operationalization of it, take a look at some of these strategies. Are you going to need a regional steering committee? And again, going back to Region 9, that was one of our goals, is to establish that regional steering committee. Do you need to establish operating guidelines or bylaws? Are you interested in using a collaborative platform? And what platform will that be? Will it be Google? Will it be
Office 365,
Office 365, etc.?
And for us, we've kind of already established, and I think for most of us out there that have been working collaboratively, you've been already probably using Google, because a lot of our resources were already established there. And we really want to ensure that we have a collaborative platform that allows everybody to see and to be in the loop of the conversations being held, but also to be able to provide input and provide their own feedback, and also be able to share that data that eventually we're going to be looking at together.
Also, it helps that everyone is engaged in building the agenda. Everyone is able to find the resources and the data that you're going to be using, or any other documents, by having that collaborative platform. And then also then agreeing on your meetings. What does that meeting calendar look like? Or are you going to have a project calendar? And what's that going to look like? And then finally, your agenda. What agenda template do you want to use? What are some reoccurring items on your agendas? The minutes. What are those going to look like? Who are you going to share those minutes? Are those in-house? Do you have to worry about sunshine laws? Do you eventually want to become a little bit more transparent and share it with the community? And then data. How are you going to go about sharing data? So these are some things that you have to ask yourself in your region. And it's going to look different from region to region, right? But you have to ask yourself, what would you like to accomplish by using these strategies? So before we move on, for those of you out there, I'd like you to reflect and pick one of these right now and share with us in the chat, which one do you think would be most beneficial for your region to start with in collaboration? And what would you like to accomplish by using that particular strategy?
And while we're waiting for some individuals to type some of their own thoughts in, I know Yolanda just mentioned about one of our priorities here for our region was to establish a steering committee. But one of the other things we had discussed, just to flip it around and give another perspective, was to potentially create a website for our region, where it could be then a public domain for individuals to be able to see where we are as a region, what we're working towards, where our agendas can be posted, where our meetings can be held. And I see here that another suggestion was looking at the challenges between one county and another, and maybe having to establish an MOUs.
The others? Okay.
So as we get into establishing steering committees or the key players for this, I think it's really important to establish some rules. How are we all going to play in this sandbox? What are those expectations among that we can, the best way I've heard it so far is, how can we build that trust? That's going to be the first component of all this, because without that trust, we won't be able to have those honest conversations of where our programs are, what do we need to accomplish as we start creating priorities and sharing those, that we all feel not just valued, but that we all have a return on that investment.
Also, establishing those rules or those procedures of how we're going to operate are critical, so that we all understand how are we going to move a decision forward. So for example, if we decide in our region to have how do we decide what our priority is of, let's say, having a common intake and what that intake looks like, right? Is there going to be a vote or not? Who gets to vote? If you have 4 individuals from the same organization, do they all get a vote or not? I think in order to eliminate or minimize misunderstandings moving forward, these are the kinds of things that you have to discuss within whoever those key stakeholders are, and what you're going to call yourself, whether you're going to be a regional steering committee, whatever your name, a governance group, whatever you're going to call yourself, build that foundation.
So as we were putting this together, part of what my mind always goes is, how does this really look like in terms of a year or 2 years? And so for me, a big piece was establishing a calendar. I know we early on, our region had talked about, we want to meet monthly. So whether you meet on a monthly basis or 3 times a year or 4 times a year, here's a sample of pieces that I thought would be typical conversation pieces, whether if it's August, September, and October, we might be looking at our annual plan as a group, as a region. What is that annual plan going to look like? What are those priorities? What are those deliverables? And this is a perfect time at the beginning of the year. I've written my grants my grant has just been awarded. I've just received it. But even then, I've already seen that I may have lost a teacher, or different needs have come up. So I might need to do some budget revisions at this time, knowing that if we're working on this as a collaborative region, this might even be a topic of conversation that might involve multiple new entities. And so we need to have these conversations on a regular basis. As we move into the middle of the school year now, we might be looking at some enrollment and performance deliverables, some of the expenditures reports, any budget amendments we might need to establish. Are we on point with spending our funds, and a status of those priorities?
In establishing that sample meeting calendar, my recommendation would be, if your group can decide that you're going to be meeting, whether it's the first Monday of every month or the third Thursday of every month, whatever it is, keep it consistent, because everyone is busy, everyone has a full plate. But moving forward, if everyone has it on their calendar, hopefully it will lead to more of a commitment, and those individuals that need to be present, because there's nothing worse than having a meeting and you don't have the key partners there. Without the key partners there, you can't continue to move forward your priorities and your agenda. It makes it very difficult to make those decisions. So having that established day of the month, if you're doing it monthly or if you're doing it quarterly, do it well in advance so everyone can schedule it on their calendar.
And then the positive, the take that I've gathered from this is it also helps keep us all moving in a common direction. I know I get very busy in the middle of the year or throughout the year, and all of a sudden I forget that I needed to put together a report to the Department of Ed. And so these conversations, if had early enough, could be tickles along the way of things we need to be ready for the upcoming, because we're all dealing with the same work. So then we get into more diving a little deeper into an agenda and looking at an agenda and what might be some components of a regular agenda. It could be fiscal updates where we're talking about those budget amendments. Not knowing how this is all going to look like in the future, we still know that we're all going to have to deal with some form of budget, some form of expenditures, and ensuring that we're spending our money in a timely manner. Or as we look at deliverables and developing a plan, what is that plan? Are we on point to meeting that plan and those goals? Looking at our enrollment and performance, one of the things we're having conversations right now is even with our IET enrollment, our completions, our placement, or our lack of. I think this will provide an opportunity to have honest conversations to really drill down to how do we improve our programs.
And with the meeting agenda, you can go ahead and create a template with your regional partners and determine what are those standing items that you want to address from month to month. That doesn't mean you can't change it down the road as you continue to evolve, but that gives you an idea so that everyone comes to the meetings prepared with what's going to be discussed. Also, my recommendation is that those agendas are collaborative. Build them in a collaborative platform like Google Drive or Office 365 so that everyone that is that key partner has freedom to add to the agenda if needed.
So then part of all this, I like to start with the end in mind often and kind of think about, well, if we build something, what should it look like? What would the ideal vision for this be? And so here were some ideas we've pulled from different states of how they are looking at these collaborative partnerships. And these are some indicators, potentially, some sample indicators. But if we're really looking at coming together, what's the intent? Ultimately, the intent is to build better programs, better adult education programs that meets the needs of our community and our students. And so is this partnership have the components embedded to really support that? Or is it really set up to be destructive? And so this is really where we need to look at how and what we want to do to accomplish our end goal. How are we engaging not only our partners, but also potential students and employers? As we talk about sharing, part of the conversation might be, how do we share students? If we're talking about moving students as they move from our classes to maybe IET to maybe hopefully technical training or employment, do we have a common language as far as an intake or an assessment? The states made it and the feds have made it very easy for us already. Most of our intake process is identical across the state. It's a requirement. Our assessment tools are identical because it's a requirement. So based on that, we already have some great infrastructure set in place that allows us to move students. And so we want to make sure that these pieces are embedded within.
But you can't do this if trust does not exist, right? So each region is different. The level of trust is different from region to region. So you really have to look internally within the partners in your region and say, do we have that trust among each other? Are we all committed to students and to better outcomes? And if we don't have that trust, what do we need to do to build that trust? Because without trust, those collaborative partnerships cannot move forward. And so you have to address, at the end of the day, we have to be strong and we have to face our struggles. And if there's anything keeping us from that trust, we have to address it in order to be able to move forward.
So a moment for reflection. What support do you need to identify, connect, support, and sustain the operationalization of this collaboration? So as we talk about that, we have those similar questions, but now it's really more reflecting on the support pieces.
Right. So where are you if regional steering committee is critical for you as a strategy? Take a minute. If that is something that is important to you right now, where are you in terms of being able to develop that steering committee? Or do you need professional development or resources? Feel free to type it in the chat box. Or is it the collaborative platform? Are the regional partners all familiar with how to use a collaborative platform, whether it's Google Drive or Office 365? Do they know the full potential? Do you need some training on how to use those collaborative platforms to move the operationalization of collaboration forward? Do you know how to establish meetings, projects, calendars? Do you need ideas? We developed some resources. They're on the IPDA website, which can help you with that. Same thing with agenda, minutes, share data. And for those of you that are interested in writing bylaws or operating guidelines, what supports or professional developments do you need in order to engage with some of these strategies? So if you have any ideas or want to share your thoughts, please type them in the chat box.
I know for us, one of the ones we're already starting the conversation of is, what does an MOU look like? What will that, if we really look at collaborating together and funds come in and we have to establish an MOU, what would that MOU look like? How is that structure going to be built? What's a frame for that?
Anyone typed anything in the chat?
No, it's a quiet audience. So here we come back to the big overview. So we've talked about exploration, we've talked about the installation. So now we're going to move into that the implementation cycle, the initial and the full implementation. So as we move to that level, we have some key questions to consider. Does your region partner in a way that intentionally shares the power and the decision-making process?
So as you're putting those things into practice, the creation of the minutes, the creation of the guidelines, the creation of the steering committee, along those ways, in order to really fully implement it, you have to come back and continuously question yourselves. Are we doing this? Are we sharing power? Or are we leaving people out of the conversation?
Are you allowing enough time to have those conversations, to create those opportunities for connecting, engaging, and partnering together? And finally, how are you going to exercise that role, that leadership and power?
Right. And as you're doing this now, in order to move from initial implementation to full implementation, you have to continuously practice this from month to month to month.
So we've talked a little bit about the initial implementation, and this is really where you've established your roles, you've established the priorities, you've established some operating procedures and calendars and agenda, and now we're really ready to move into that implementation aspect. So in full implementation here, we've already set those pieces in place, and our focus now shifts from establishing the roles and building the infrastructure to really now focusing on the priorities and maybe even identifying new priorities and ensuring students the ultimate mission, which is that student success, employee success.
And one of the beauties of, if you really spend the time in building that foundation, as players change, right? because people come and go. If you fully operationalize and commit these things to paper, when someone new comes in, they'll be able to pick up and they'll understand what your operating structure looks like. They'll understand the things by looking at your agendas and your minutes of what work your region has been engaged in, and then how they can continue to move that work forward.
And so I see a couple of messages coming through the chat in terms of definitely needing some training in the implementation and development of resources, and also ensuring that key stakeholders are at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're going to be the decision makers, so we need to make sure we have those individuals. So we've talked enough about that. We skipped. So as we come to that full cycle, each region is very unique. You each have to determine what works for you and your programs and your students. But as you're coming together, we want to make sure you'll want to make sure that we've established that trust, you've established those key players, and you've established those priorities and roles. One of the other questions that came in is a couple of districts have already talked about establishing quarterly agendas to meet on a regular basis.
Exactly. And so if your region has not, then who's going to take that lead to happen? So I know, like for Region 9, we've already established that we're going to be meeting later this month, right? And so now for us, we have to make sure, is our agenda already in place for everyone to be able to add to it? Or what do we need to do in order to be prepared for that first meeting? So think back to your region, whatever region you're from. If you have not already taken that step, someone has to take that lead of reaching out to the other partners and saying, we need to move forward. Let's go ahead and establish a time to meet. And let's start talking about these things that we need to do it in order to operationalize our partnerships.
So for us here in Region 9, we've already established our upcoming meeting for the end of January. And that meeting is really intended for us to start, now that we've submitted our plan, to really now open it up again, reflect a little bit on it, and really start talking about our next steps in this process. We're not sure where we're going to be going with the state with this. We're not sure which players are going to be fully involved, invested, and which ones are not yet, but we're all still very interested in working together and collaborating. We know we've already established some items in particular that we've wanted to talk more about. Some of those are our focus of developing a website. Second, for recruitment and outreach. Another piece that we've also talked about doing is focusing on our, and I just blanked out.
IET programs.
On our IET programs, where we're going to be trying to develop a common IET. So for us right now, moving forward, it's establishing the procedures and for the at the installation phase, but at the same time, continuing the conversation of what's really needed and how can we best support each other within the region. So we've come to the end, and here, if you have any questions, or feel free to reach out. You have our contact information. Right now, we're all, as always, we're very interested in your feedback. You should be seeing a poll that's been just provided, and take a moment to complete the poll and answer the few questions. While you're doing that, our next webinar will be next week, January 18th at 3 p.m. With the focus on implementing an interest-based approach to regional partnership development. We hope this was a meaningful webinar, and we look to see you next week.